All right, so this is the first official sponsored episode of the podcast. If you're listening and you're a personal trainer and you want to join a personal trainer community, we have a new community called the Modern Meathead Personal Trainer Community, where you can access all sorts of different things, such as my entire online course, my programming course, biomechanics course, exclusive members lectures, as well as exercise libraries, Q&A call recordings, and much more, including potentially future access to being here live on the podcast. So with that in mind, this week, we're going to talk about deloads, and specifically something I wanted to add on to the conversation of deloads was soreness. These are two topics we've definitely touched on. At this point, it's hard to find a topic in some sense that we haven't touched on. But, you and I were talking about deloads this week, given that you just went through a deload yourself. And I kind of want to take people through like what your thought process is. And specifically because I've heard some of the things that you've been thinking about before, not only this week, but just prior, I'm going to kind of play the role of like, I've never heard this paradigm sort of a thing, just as like, because I'm sure many people, including me up until you have given me your thoughts on deloads, haven't had this perspective on deloading. I think the normal perspective is like, oh, a deload is a week where we just kind of like stop training, so that we can super compensate and then be fantastic the following week. And usually gets left at that, I think, in the more public sphere. So anyhow, that's kind of the intro, and I wanted to ask you some questions specifically also on soreness, which was inspired by Broderick Chavez, who I was actually listening to the other day. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Where I wanted to start, though, with you in particular, is just sort of your framing insofar as like general reasons to deload and how do you know when you need a deload. So I know that you are fairly calculated about the different kinds of things that you laid out. But I think a lot of people maybe are in a sort of middle ground position where maybe they're sort of tracking their sets and their reps and their weight, but they're not really tracking timelines as rigidly as you are. So the sort of basic question that I want to start with is like, what are the sort of things that you think about when it comes to recognizing that you need a deload? Like what do you need a deload for to begin with? And how do you determine when to sort of do it?
So I think regardless of like what your paradigm is, as long as the first decision you make then influences the next decision after that, as long as like the thought process is relatively, contiguous across the board, I think you could be right going in a lot of different directions, but you just need to start with some general paradigm to work off of. So much like we've discussed, with the training stimulus I employ, there's some things off the bat that I basically just prioritize. There are other things that, might be considered preferences. And then once you make that, initial decision, you basically then, have a roadmap, almost like if you were, laying out a puzzle and you kind of just frame it first. It makes it easier to fill in the rest. So a lot of the training decisions that I make just kind of start with like higher order decisions, and then I just work backwards. So a lot of times, one of the main higher order decisions is just laying out a time frame. And I don't think, again, there's necessarily like a proven right or wrong here, but every decision you make, thereafter is influenced by the first one. So when I'm thinking about like a time frame for a training block, um, there's just an inverse relationship between the length of the block and basically like how rapidly you want to, increase your training stress over that time, or what your sort of average training stress relative to, what you can adapt to is over that period. So it's much like looking at, training intensity versus, training volume. In this case, like intensity being more so like a intensity of effort. And if you were to say, all right, you can either train, really hard, but not do as much, or you can train not as hard and do more. Like you can, run really fast for a short amount of time, but you can't run really fast for a long amount of time. So there's always this inverse relationship between intensity and duration that just exists, on every front. So that's a first consideration, because you will see people run training programs that, only last 3 weeks, or, training blocks that last 3 weeks and then deload on the fourth week. Like, that's not uncommon at all to see sort of like a 4 week, 4 week block. And, I start off with a little bit, of a longer block that's usually averages something on the order of 16 weeks. And sometimes there's almost like a wave like approach to that, where maybe it's kind of going up for 8 weeks, takes a small dip, goes up for another 8 weeks. But, just some observations like in myself and in clients, and again, like the way that I decide to program and the way that I decide to do, individual sets, I think really, sets up that whole equation as far as like how long this block is going to be. So I can probably talk on this for like the next hour. So without like just, dragging on this point too long, I'll pause here for a second and just make sure you're kind of, following along.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about deloads, we kind of start with the paradigm of like, we're going to lay out a time frame here to kind of actually create a map. And the timeline, in essence, when it creates the map, sort of dictates, with the map analogy, how far the journey is going to be. And if the journey is going to be longer, we can't sort of just book it as fast as we can. And if the journey is maybe going to be a little bit shorter, maybe we could do that. But if it's shorter, we certainly wouldn't want to just be walking backwards. So the question there remains, you start with 16 weeks on average, just the average number to throw out there. But you don't necessarily see anything wrong with 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 20 weeks, depending on the time frame.
Yeah, I would say there are absolutely blocks that run somewhere on the length of 8 weeks for me, and there are absolutely ones that run, on the low end of 20.
So if you're dealing with, just say, like your average Joe client, and you have very little data, very little information in your head, is your sort of arbitrary landmark of a time frame somewhere around like 12 weeks, or is it still?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. If it's someone that's coming in for a consult, like the type of people that are listening to this podcast, but not like your Gen Pop client that
Yeah.
might train 3 times a week, for years. If it's someone who's coming in who's got, a reasonable training history, good adherence, and, understand sort of the basic principles, of resistance training, then yeah, it's very common for that block to be, like I said, somewhere around the 12, 16 week mark.
Yeah, and I think it's good that you make that caveat of population, and specifically because, you know, when I was just training people in the general population, I never really found a need in a vast majority of cases to even think about deloads. It was just like, as you've mentioned before, there's not enough work being done every week to really necessitate it. And limiters are often not training related in many cases. Not to say that they can't be non-training related in other areas, they often are. But that's a good point to make, is just someone who's very sort of rigidly committed to their routine, and is locked in with training, dialed in with training. I think this is more who this applies to. And maybe this is a good point to make more broadly, is like, I know for me personally, when I first got into powerlifting, deloads are like one of the biggest topics that come up just in your initial search of like information, at least in the powerlifting space. And so some people will detail out very specifically what you need to do, when you need to do it, how you need to do it. And then other people will be like, if you're a noob, just don't even think about it. Like, don't even worry about it. And I think the answer, like most other things, is somewhere in between. There's no reason that you can understand it and not, necessarily, just copy other people or just do it arbitrarily. So anyway, not to get too sidetracked, we start with that timeline, we'll say 12 to 16 weeks, and then where do we sort of go from there in terms of following along with this paradigm and these steps?
Yeah, so I like to reflect back on the data, over that course of time. Like, of course, every week, observing potential signs and symptoms of fatigue, monitoring performance, but I'm not making changes based on, oh, I woke up this day and this is how I feel. I woke up this day and I'm this sore. When you can look back on data across a longer period of time, I think you just take out some of that day-to-day noise, and you know the next time you program a block, try to make some corrections for things that maybe didn't go as well the first time, or maybe you're looking back on similar scenarios. If I'm programming for like a pre-contest period, that might be a little bit different, than the peak of off season. But just having this data across time, I think is, a a lot more realistic way to sort of like compare outcomes than just trying to look on, a much more acute scale. But in both cases, like, we're penciling in a hypothesis. We're saying, okay, based on my previous experience, this is how long I can tolerate, this amount of training stress. But then, of course, like, there's other lifestyle variables, like I said, with pre-contest nutritional variables, and there's tons of moving parts. So on average, across, let's say 12, 16 weeks, those parts might be relatively similar across blocks. Maybe they're not, from day to day or even week to week, but averaged across time, they tend to be more similar than they would be, say, day to day. And you now start to just formulate, some better hypotheses in terms of like, could I do a little bit more? Should I do a little bit less? And the next time you design a block, you just pencil all that stuff in. But you're open to the idea, because there are so many moving parts, that it might need to be changed. So the further out it is, kind of like the more gray those assumptions are. So you might lay out, if you have a contest in mind, you may lay out as much as an entire year. But as you get close, closer and closer to the contest, a lot of those assumptions will have been false.
So,
Um,
so
yeah,
if you don't have past data to sort of reflect on, and maybe you're doing something, maybe you're embarking on this like tracking journey for the first time, is it your contention that that phase is kind of like a phase to look at sort of as an observational period where you just kind of lay something out, you take a best guess, and you attempt to pay attention? Because I know that like something you would do specifically, I don't know if you still do it, is on specific timelines, like you'd write down the date and you'd say, this is how I feel on this day, and these are the symptoms that I, was reported. And not everyone maybe needs to do, maybe needs to be that specific about it, but it's more just a general approach of like, you're treating this as a best guess. Let me just kind of see what comes up. Is that how sort of it would go maybe for, if it were like a novel experience for someone?
yeah. I mean, I think the population we're talking about is never coming in with a completely novel experience, right? It's more like the other type of client, like maybe the personal training client you get for the first time.
Sure.
But anytime we're getting someone from this population, even if it's not data they've been, calculating and putting in spreadsheets, and they don't have it formalized, there's still a lot of information that they have, and they've fallen into a place for one reason or another that like is comfortable, or is creating problems, and maybe that's why they're seeing you. But no matter what, there's a conversation to be had with your coach or with yourself to sort of diagnose, like, okay, here's the goal, here's the timeline I have to achieve the goal, here are what I perceive as maybe some limiting steps to achieving that goal, and here's the hypothesis I'm going to create around correcting for those. And then you simply just test that hypothesis and rinse and repeat.
All right, cool. Makes sense. So we start with our timeline. We sort of get a vague idea of volume intensity, data reflection, all that good stuff, both in terms of prior experience and current. And so when do we maybe start to think about like, okay, I get to the end of, the 12-week time span, maybe the 16-week time span, or maybe, we could talk about exceptions after this. Um, you arrive at a point where you're like, okay, I'm done with this timeline that I've laid out. What kind of goes into the decision making then about what direction you take insofar as the pivot, in terms of, do I go toward lower training stress for a period, i.e. the deload bridge, whatever you want to call it, or do I go, do I just sort of keep pushing things and keep moving on? How do we sort of, make an analysis of that fork in the road?
Yeah, it always comes back to the premise that you are trying to measure the goal, you're trying to measure the outcome. You're not trying to measure the symptoms, and side effects. So if you have reached your goal, you are there, like, and a lot of people forget that when they're trying to conceptualize this whole thing. Is just like, when should I do this? When should I do that? Like, how do I know if it's time? It always has to come back to measuring the outcome that you want to achieve. So if we lay this out like in a more, practical sense here, someone could say like, you know, let's say the most common thing, like, I want to lose X amount of weight or I want to gain X amount of weight. Like, you've determined either you're too fat or you're not muscular enough, and you want to lay out, and let's say there's no, competition in mind. Like, most people listening, are not preparing for a bodybuilding show, most likely. But it's still kind of the same premise, is like, I have, this goal of getting bigger or getting leaner, and now I have to set some realistic parameters around that. And you start, when you said before, what if someone's doing this for the first time? That's when we kind of lean on, research and anecdote to say, like, what's a realistic, gain or loss that we can achieve in this time period. And the more personal data you have, the more you can individualize that. So we could say, like, what's a reasonable rate of weight gain to not put on too much fat? Very different between someone who's been training for 20 years as a natural versus someone who just started lifting and is enhanced, right? So you can see where those, like, would really vary based on sort of a more personalized approach, but kind of that middle of the road of like, okay, you've been, you're not a stark beginner, natural, but you've been, training for a few years. What kind of gain can we expect here? And same thing on the loss side, like, how much fat can we expect to lose without losing a significant amount of muscle? And then, what's a realistic time frame, that I can do this in, either because I'm trying to achieve it by a certain date, or because, like, you're just going to accumulate enough fatigue in terms of like getting to that point that you're going to need some type of a break. So, let's assume in this case, again, we'll just kind of make it as vague as possible, because like the ones that aren't vague become very obvious. Where, like I said, where you have a contest date or, a summer vacation or whatever, and you're trying to get lean for it. But let's say it's more vague and it's just like, I want to get more jacked. And that's maybe where people have more difficulty kind of laying this stuff out. And that's, where my bias kind of comes in terms of just like making these blocks a little bit longer. Is like, all right, you want to put on, some amount of muscle here. And, you want to at least have an amount that's going to be noticeable. Maybe not even visually, but like in some way measurable. Like, if we can't measure it, we can't track it, we can't compare it to prior data, it's just really difficult to know, like, if anything happened. So that's, one consideration there is like, what's kind of the least measurable difference, in terms of like, gaining muscle across, a given time frame. And in my opinion, if you're only going to, run a block before changing the environment, and the environment being like your nutritional intake, like your training plan, like, I just don't think it's enough time to really measure the outcome that you're going for. So if the outcome is you want some proxies to see if you've gained any amount of muscle or you've gotten too fat, I just think like a month time frame, one, from a performance standpoint, my personal experience, my experience with clients is usually after 3 weeks or so, people are like just getting in the groove of things. Like, they're whether they're doing new exercises, and they're kind of relearning those, even exercises, when I say relearning, that they've done before, but when you haven't done something for, even a few months, there's a pretty rapid increase in performance just right off the bat. And if all you're doing is running the program for a few weeks and you're just seeing that like acute bump and sort of relearning things, or even just getting like comfortable with, putting weight, loading yourself axially, or just learn, or sort of like getting the setup down. There's so many like practical considerations around starting something new. Plus, it's just inherently stressful to do something novel, like moving homes, and a new training block may change a lot of things about the environment. You may do certain exercises at one gym and other exercises at another gym. So you have to build your schedule around it. It might be, you change your training frequency, and that requires you to, sort of move the rest of your schedule around. Like there's a lot of considerations that really like influence the overall like impact on your life. And I think that's really meaningful as well, is just the more like consistency and reliability, stability that you can have, in your day-to-day routine. I think the more, beneficial that is, from the standpoint of growing. So I like things to be relatively consistent. I like things to be, long enough where we can see some, noticeable difference, and long enough where we're not just seeing like this, acute bump in performance, and we're not introducing, such instability at these like regular intervals, versus just getting someone comfortable with the program, getting someone comfortable with the changes in their lifestyle, and then being able to see like, all right, here was my hypothesis, like did it work, did it not work? So that's kind of why I favor, those longer time periods. And may have gotten away from like the initial question. Do you remember where we started with that?
No, that was good because you gave context to the initial question there was essentially like you've arrived at the end of a training period, and you sort of initially answered by saying, well, once you arrived to that point, did you achieve X,
Oh,
Y, Z outcome that you were looking to? And now we come to that, the additional fork of like, okay, let's assume that we do achieve what we want to achieve, assuming that we know what to measure and how to measure it, and how to make sure that it's standardized. Um, when you get to that point of like, okay, I'm moving in the right direction. I know that what I'm doing is working based on what I'm seeing, and what I can hypothesize moving forward. In that instance, would it be unreasonable then for someone to be like to even think about worrying about a deload? Or do you think that it's something that should be more of like a proactive kind of intention? The sort of old conversation of proactive versus reactive deloading is kind of something that has been very prevalent in powerlifting for some time. But with with powerlifting, it's like the outcomes that you're measuring can can vary in such a short time frame. It's like, to the point about performance, someone could be benching 225 for 3 on week 1, and if they're sort of detrained and coming back into training, they could end up doing sets of like 8 to 10 within 4 to 8 weeks. Like, it's ridiculous the amount of change that you can see. And so it's much more obvious, especially when you're lifting much higher magnitudes of load for much lower relative reps in the average set, to basically get a good idea of like, do I feel like shit? How is the weight moving? It's much more of like an objectively easy thing to sort of analyze. So maybe then a good question would be, well, I don't want to sort of derail the path we're going down too much right now.
I remember now that I have the initial question, I could tell you
Yeah.
like where it's
Yeah,
going,
yeah.
which is like, okay, let's say again, you have this like really vague goal. You just want to be more jacked, and you don't know how to run your training block, but you say, okay, Ethan told me that I'm probably going to be able to do this, somewhere on the order of, 8 to 20 weeks before, the wheels start to fall off. And then again, let's just try to, play devil's advocate here and say like, all right, you've gotten to 20 weeks and you've achieved your goal, whatever that is, right? And you say, okay, like, should I deload? I feel fine. If you get to that point, either you set a really low goal or you're a beginner. Because if you're really like moving at a pace where you're going to drive significant progress and you're able to survive, 20 weeks of that and just like everything is fine, um, chances are you're just not pushing that hard during that period. So it's kind of like great. Um, I don't see a huge downside in just proactively, maybe taking a break there. But I just don't think in reality, people are moving fast enough to be able to like really create adaptation and doing all the other things outside of the gym that require like significant impacts, to other systems, whether that be you're gaining weight and there's a digestive burden, whether that just be like being so focused and meticulous with this goal that it has like psychosocial impacts. Like if you can realistically like make it 20 weeks where you're firing on all cylinders, and not experience fatigue, either you're just like a huge outlier or you're a complete beginner. So I just don't think that's what you actually see in practice. I don't think most people can go that long without the wheels falling off if you're going fast enough to make progress. So when you consider like the personal training client, that other example we were giving before, that's like not necessarily someone with like a lot of prior, training knowledge, experience, effort, etc. And it's mostly just an adherence thing. They can pretty much go forever at the same pace because the pace is so slow.
Mm.
So that's the thing, is because they're not really making progress on any measurable level, it just extends the blocks infinitely. Everything in our life imparts some level, of physical stress, right? It's like we don't consider it all training volume, but training volume to someone who's been on bed rest, for the last 6 weeks or whatever, getting out of the bed is, a 1 rep max, right? Like that's, a high level of training intensity.
Mhm.
So it's all relative. Like if you're not that many steps away in terms of your training stress from just like, a few walks a day, like it's all relative. So yeah, if you said, all right, my training stress is, I go through 3 10-minute walks a day, how long can I do that block for? It's like the rest of your fucking life. And it's the same thing here. It's like I train 3 times a week with like piss poor effort. And it's about like 30 minutes of actual work. How long can I train 3 times a week for 30 minutes with piss poor effort? Like for the rest of your life. And you never have to worry about deloading, but also like you'll make a little bit of progress, for a year or so, and then, probably plateau. So I think a lot of these things, again, they're sort of like self-fulfilling.
Yeah. So your contention is essentially that it should be fairly obvious when the wheels start to fall off. Because for me personally, usually it's some kind of left low back referral in tandem with some kind of left knee thing, where just overall it's like no specific exercises are bothering me, but I start to feel certain kinds of pains repeatedly, like when I start to move more in that direction, which, hasn't been for some time. But other things that you mentioned, like digestive issues, mood issues, sleep issues, all those things, uh, honestly, feel like start to crop up all sort of around a similar time frame. It seems to me that when I've experienced times where I've been like, yeah, I definitely need to take a little bit of a break from training, it's been kind of like something that is screaming at me rather than something that was sort of whispering at me. And sometimes I wonder, like, if you've gotten to that point, is it too late? Like
Yeah. Like I think the reason why you are looking back on longer time scales, reflecting, and then sort of like changing your hypothesis going forward, is the goal is not to get to the point where you experience side effects. Ideally, you would set up a paradigm where you're able to pick up on symptoms, or you're able to just pre-plan. Like if you get so good at planning that you're like, man, this just consistently happens, when I'm traveling this pace, I'm imparting this amount of stress. I just see these things happen on this typical time scale, and you're like, it happens at week 10. But you're meeting your goals. It's like, all right, we're not going to wait till week 10. We're going to do this at 8 or 9. And I think that's how you want to make your decisions, in terms of like being a little bit more biased towards staying short of problems versus saying like, how close can I get to the fire? I think you're much better off staying away from it, because the consequences of running into these problems a lot of times are like, multiple steps back. Whereas like you can just take one step back, reduce fatigue, and start taking steps forward. There are a lot of problems you run into, and it's somewhat inevitable because you don't know where you are on the spectrum of fatigue. And it's impossible to get it right all the time. So inevitably, if you are moving fast, like, you're going to hit potholes, and it's going to be, at times catastrophic, ideally not. And, that'll just come down to like, how resilient of a human you are, how, lucky you are. Maybe if you're someone who's just like more predisposed to take on risk, you run into more of these problems, than someone else. But at the end of the day, the goal is not to find the problems and then stop. The goal is to either pick up on symptoms that are um, not particularly impactful in the long term, and to be able to identify those as like early signs of the greater symptoms, or just to get an idea of like what time course those things happen in. So again, we're kind of starting with like, let's look back on prior. We have a general framework that's based on either research or anecdote, and then we narrow that down even further based on like individual anecdote or individual like experience of saying, okay, yeah, I know that like Ethan says 8 to 20 weeks or so, but I find for me it happens around 10. And then we layer on top of that the subjective experience of like, all right, if it happens at 10, maybe I shoot for 8 weeks. But at week 7, I'm starting to pick up on these signs that time and time again have told me that, okay, if I go another couple weeks, maybe it's going to be problematic. Those are kind of like the layers of decision making. I think a really big mistake that people make when thinking about like laying out this time frame, like achieving a specific goal and like how much stimulus they need to achieve it. Oftentimes they're trying to measure fatigue and not measure the stimulus. And they're assuming that the two sort of peak at the same point. Like the assumption is like the point in which I get the most possible stimulus is also the point just short of falling off the cliff of fatigue. So if I can take it right to the cliff and not go over it, that's when I'm going to get the most benefit. And I just don't think that is like an accurate assessment of like how adaptation works. It is kind of like a simple framework of just like, okay, more is always better. And if I can take it, to just short of breaking, that's where I'm going to get my best benefits. But that's not what we see necessarily like in research or in anecdote. And there's a big difference between like what is the level of stimulus you need for adaptation and what level of stimulus you can tolerate. And that makes it really difficult because it is very difficult to measure on an acute and even on a chronic timeline the effect of a stimulus, such as like, having the goal of hypertrophy, right? Like we don't have any really strong biochemical markers where we can be like, okay, you did the right amount of training today. And we don't really have any practical markers where we can say, all right, after 16 weeks or so, I know that your vastus lateralis, grew this much, and let's just rinse and repeat, and we'll dial into exactly how many sets you need, to optimize vastus lateralis growth. Um, we're just not there at this point. We're kind of like, walking around in the dark, with a pin light, so to speak. So, we're we're using fatigue somewhat as a guiding principle. We know that, we want to stay short of anything catastrophic, but just keeping in mind that like a maximal level of fatigue is not the goal. Sometimes it's just like a, an unwanted consequence.
Yeah, and I think something important that you alluded to there was the difference potentially um, between the individual who's kind of like a noob intermediate who gets to that point of fatigue, like maybe your severe fatigue is something that is not particularly catastrophic. Like maybe it's just a sort of mild, pain or discomfort or anything similar. But as you become more advanced, it makes sense to me that as you magnify the capacity to create stress, that the punishment for, we'll say, overfilling the cup becomes also sort of exponential in terms of its negative effects. So, where once maybe it was like a couple day setback, you just took a few days off. Now it's a week, 2 weeks, a month, several months. And so the more that, advanced you become, I think the more relevant potentially that what you're describing of sort of not just chasing fatigue, but rather chasing stimulus and bridging that gap and making sure that that gap stays sufficiently, filled. I think that becomes more and more important. And, I've seen this on a multitude of occasions, just listening to like some advanced or more advanced bodybuilders talk about like injury closer to competition. And the conversation usually goes like, oh, everything was going so well. And then it was just this one exercise where it was just like snap. And I think that that is something that kind of misses the point that you're trying to describe here, which is that I think that if you've gotten to that point and you've done that exercise for as long as you have, barring some sort of freak circumstance where the fucking whatever machine you're using snaps and it fucking, hits you in the head and you get a concussion or whatever, something crazy like that. I think usually it's something that not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily predictable, but it was something that sort of tells you what you need to know about the preceding whatever amount of time where maybe you were ignoring other symptoms or so just the point being that it's always this combination of things. At least most often it's never just this one exercise on this one day where I got hurt just randomly. It was like, well, what was the difference between that and when you were doing it for 50 weeks prior to that, or leading up to whatever. So um, the point there just being that I think the conversation usually does get to sort of myopically focused on uh, what happens at the cliff rather than before the cliff, which is obviously a common sort of theme amongst a lot of different kinds of conversations like this. So I want to turn this now to like, okay, we've arrived at you're taking a deload and you're approaching the actual X's and O's of how the specific deload that you're going to take is going to look and how it's going to be different from the prior weeks. So from a sort of paradigm-based paradigm-based approach, what are the sorts of things that you sort of think are helpful for people to know about the way that you do deloads now and potentially how that's changed over time just across your years of experience? Where do you sort of start?
Yeah, when you were describing a minute ago, um, you know, hearing anecdotes from advanced lifters, and just potentially how much more impactful, you know, overreaching their, recovery abilities can be. It makes me just think of kind of how I base this whole paradigm, which is just like, on rate limiters. I use that term a lot. And to me, it's just like the more advanced you get, the more, each of those things is just sort of climbing the ladder. Like each of those potential limiters is just getting to a higher and higher magnitude in terms of like how hard it is to achieve the necessary threshold for that thing to be sufficient. So just to clarify here, um, if, when I was, let's say, 200 pounds and I wanted to, put on some muscle, let's say I could eat, 3,500 calories. And that was, sufficient, to be in a much in a surplus that allowed me, to gain muscle. And then as I got bigger and now, 300 pounds, that number, could be 6,500 calories, right? It's a really simple example of like, well, if I ate that 3,500 calories that I was eating when I was 200 pounds, it would be insufficient, most likely, um, you know, all other conditions being the same, to be stimulated for muscle growth. So then my rate limiter would be just like, I don't have enough calories. And you really do see in practice, like it is cool with enhanced athletes where it's like when one of those things isn't present, it doesn't matter how much drugs you take. It really just doesn't supersede that. And that's a really cool thing to just see time and time again. It's like, let's say someone in this, particular example, someone's at the end of a diet where they've just accumulated a lot of fatigue in either direction. Either they've gotten, really heavy and things like, digestion are getting poor, or, they're really lean and calories, are very low. And then you just try to throw a bunch of drugs at the problem. And it's like, uh, let's take the example of someone who's really heavy and digestion's poor and, their sleep is getting worse. And you see their performance is starting to plateau. And you just throw a bunch of drugs, say a bunch of, anabolics at it. And you expect, oh man, like this is a pretty big increase. Like they should see, their performance go up. And in a lot of cases, that just doesn't work, or you're at the end of a diet, you're really lean, and it's just like same thing. Well, if we're partitioning more of these nutrients, towards muscle tissue and, away from fat through, just some sort of like, you know, mix of different, pharmacological approaches here, that should move the needle. But, when it's simply that you just need to, eat less calories or move more, you just see how much more that moves the needle than trying to just bolster one avenue that's already sufficient. So from it's easy sometimes when you look at it through the lens of drugs, but it's the same thing, with nutrition and training. Like if you're that person whose training stimulus is, just over the stress of 3 10-minute walks a day, it doesn't matter how high your calories go. You're not gaining more muscle. So you could jack your calories up to the moon, but if you don't have the sufficient training stimulus in play, it doesn't matter how many calories you throw at it. So no matter how you look at it, like there is going to be, one of those steps that is insufficient, for you to be able to grow. And there's a lot of those things that we can't see under the surface. Like it's easy for us to say like, all right, you have to have, enough calories to be able to stimulate muscle growth. The training has to be stressful enough, and you have to be healthy enough. And there's like so many things that go into that. Maybe like sleep being an example of it, right? Like there's some minimum amounts of these things that you need to meet to be able to, sort of push that button and, see the conveyor belt of, hypertrophy moving along. But if someone, one of those steps is insufficient, the conveyor belt stops. And it's a loose analogy, but the idea is like there is something, whether you can see it or not, that's stopping that whole process. And being able to identify what those individual steps are and being able to bolster each of them up, I think is what really drives progress. So when you have the advanced person, it's just like a lot of those things are at like a 9.5 out of 10, and then something just breaks a little sooner. When you're eating 6,500 calories, your timeline might not be the same as 3,000 calories. Like not every system has adapted to be sort of like the same in magnitude as your muscle tissue. If I put on 100 pounds of muscle tissue, my liver, my heart, my small intestine, like they haven't necessarily all adapted, to the same relative degree, right? So you do meet some of the same limiters that you might at 200 pounds. And you're not going to have necessarily the same liver, the same heart that you did, at 200 pounds, but it's probably not. Oftentimes that can be, insufficient for what you need to, make progress at 300 pounds. So anyway, I think that's kind of like the main concept here is like, what's the rate limiting step? And that brings me specifically to the question you asked is like, how do you then, make decisions about deloading? And, one of the questions I introduced when we were doing like these guest interviews, almost like the consults early on in this podcast, was just asking the person like, what is the thing that fatigues when you get to a deload? Like, what is the problem that you run into? What is, in other words, just different ways of saying, what is your rate limiting step? So like, I have this, goal of building muscle, but, when I get to this point, my performance falls off. Or when I get to this point, my digestion falls off, my sleep falls off, my mood falls off, my adherence falls off, whatever it is, like, I get to this point and this is the thing that breaks. And a lot of times it's orthopedic. And I think that's why, we've gone down the route that we have, is that more often than not, the rate limiting step is orthopedic. So when you can solve for that, I think really give yourself the best chance for success. And you can see other people have really gone hard down the route of gut health and other people with sleep, and they're all just kind of exploring different rate limiting steps. So what I like to ask when I get to the point of a deload is just, what's fatigued? What's fatigued here? And that's just based on the symptoms you're having. The symptoms could be, I'm just not excited to train anymore. Like, I'm someone who loves training, like, but man, I'm just like, I'm tired. I just don't feel like going into the gym. The symptom could be, like you said, aches and pains, and specifically where those aches and pains are. Like in your case, like you said, it doesn't seem to be associated with a specific, an exercise, just kind of like, just very general. When I get to, this point of life stress plus training stress, these things tend to hurt. And just pointing at that and saying, okay, like, what needs rest? And that's really how I look at the deload. Is just, it's not that every system needs the equal amount of rest. The question is for you, like, what's your kind of unique code? Like, what is the thing that's breaking on you? What is the thing that's becoming the rate limiter? And how do we rest that thing? And then also looking at that in the context of like, where are you going next? And, how do I need to set things up so that I can take this next journey? We're taking that cross country ride. I got to make sure, that I got enough gas in the tank, that my tire pressure, is even, like, all these things where we're sort of just like, not only saying, okay, this is what we've incurred, from the last journey, what do we need to fix, but also what's the journey we're about to embark on, because that's going to determine, how much and what type of rest you need as well.
So overall, if you end up in a situation where 12, 16, 20, whatever weeks, where you end up in the sort of ideal, quote unquote, ideal deload scenario, where it's like you just experience not necessarily any sort of orthopedic or muscular related problem, you're more so, maybe experiencing some kind of lethargic tendencies, digestive problems, whatever. You just arrived at a point where you just kind of feel slow and all that stuff, right? Assume it's that, and assume it's not some sort of local problem where it's a very obvious, like, oh, I should just decrease volume on knee related stuff because my knee feels like it's on fire, right? Assume it's kind of a general sort of a fatigued state. Would you, in that case, sort of jump to a general approach of like, I'm going to reduce for this week X, percentage volume? Would you jump to, I am going to change specific, intentions? I know we've talked about that, and that may be an interesting tangent. where do you sort of start with then? You're in that ideal deload scenario where the answer isn't necessarily obvious, but more vague and sort of general. What are the sort of guidelines that you have followed in terms of just reduction of overall training stress?
Yeah, I mean, much like laying out the time frame for the block, the options are, really wide and varied. When you say, all right, this block could be anywhere from 8 to 20 weeks, and then, you have to narrow it down from there. Just like saying, all right, based on the, recommendations in the literature, my training volume is going to be, somewhere between, 10 and 20 sets, for it to be like ideal, right? Which from there, I would expand that out a lot, where it's like there are plenty of people anecdotally, in the research as well, when you're just looking at like the individual participants, who would do very well with 6 sets, and people clearly are doing well with 30 plus sets. So now it's like, how much training volume do I do? Well, somewhere between, like 4 and 40 sets, but if we just like have no starting place, then we're like, all right, start at 10 to 20 and we'll figure it out from there. Same thing with training block length. There are plenty of people who are successful with 4 week training blocks. I don't think many people are doing 30, but you're 4 to 20 something or whatever. And it's just like, it's so vague, right? So same thing here. It's like, people make cases where it's like, man, you can maintain muscle mass on like almost no volume, or literally no volume. Like you can take the week off, completely. And, based on the information we have now, there's no reason to expect that like you would lose anything meaningful during a week, even 2 weeks. Now there's the reality of like, if there was no like need to do that in those weeks, you could have been making progress. So like, even if you don't regress, you're still missing time that you could have been training. But realistically, it could range anywhere from like, you know again, on the crazy end, it's like months of not training. You come back and you'll catch up really quick. But more realistically, probably like a week of no training and you'll be fine. All the way to the other end of just like maybe it's a 20% reduction in training stress, whether that be done through sets or effort or whatever. So you see, there's just so many ways, to skin a cat here. So it is funny because the cats are sitting right next to me. So
Fucked up.
doing that. Like that is kind of a shitty expression. Um, but then from there, I think, when you're asking these questions of like, okay, it's just very general. We don't really like have anything specific, to go on here. I think there is always more specificity than, maybe people give themselves credit for. It's just really being able to have that conversation with yourself and sort of knowing yourself or your client on a personal level. So it would be like asking, like, okay, Ben, Saturday is your day off work, like just making this up, like you don't, open your phone at all on those days. Like it's just like a day to, rest, relax, have fun. Like, what do you do to rest, relax, and or have fun? And your answer, would be very different than the next person. Like one person might be like, I play Call of Duty, and like, I order, Domino's pizza, and the next person might be like, I go rock climbing and I just like to be outside in nature, so it ends up being so specific when you ask people like, well, what do you like to do? What makes you feel relaxed? And I think that's how you answer a lot of these things is I look at it not necessarily as like, oh, it should be, intensity of effort, or it should be, number of sets. There's so many ways to arrange things, and you really just have to ask, like, what is it that you feel like doing? Like, what would make you feel rested during this period? And it may simply be like, for that specific moment in time, It might be like, I just don't want to go to the gym as often this week. Okay, we'll pack it into, 2 training days or whatever. It might be that like, I just don't want to touch heavy shit this week. Like, I'm just so tired of like lifting heavy weights. All right, it's going to be a reduction, you know, in load on the bar. It might be like I just get so psyched up, to train. Like I just need to, back off a little bit. Okay, we're reducing, intensity of effort. Or the next person's like, I don't want to train unless I'm training balls to the wall. So maybe that person, all right, still train balls to the wall, but you're just going to do, a reduction in the number of sets you do and or the number of days you go to the gym. The next person's like, you know, I'm traveling this week, but it also happens to be a deload week, and I'm, in some country, some like third world country that has no gym. Like, should I just try to like, make the most of it and, carry rocks up the side of the mountain, or like, should I just completely take off? Right. Like those are the type of decisions you run into. And it's just like, well, would you really enjoy carrying rocks up the side of the mountain? Like, are you someone who just needs to be physically active all the time in order to feel good? So it becomes so personalized when you're just asking like, what is it that, much like, selecting your favorite meal, that's kind of what you're doing here. Is you're just kind of like, you're just designing your meal, and you're just saying like, all right, I've been dieting for all this time and I just want the perfect meal. And that's just going to look a little bit different for everybody. And I think that's a much better way to look at the deload, is just understand that like your options are, extremely wide here. And it's an opportunity to get to know yourself. And in the beginning, you may think that rest is one thing for you, and you may realize like, oh, that's actually just, something that I do as like, a compensatory strategy. That's just something that like is habitual for me, but it doesn't actually feel like rest. So getting to know what rest feels like for you, all these concepts of sort of like taking in this interoceptive feedback in managing your schedule, your lifestyle, your relationships, like that's the totality to me of what managing fatigue is about.
Yeah, so I love all that nuance. Tell me then what Ethan Grossman's favorite deload meal is and what you ate for your deload meals this week. Not
Yeah.
not your actual meals. I'm trying to rattle it.
Okay.
Okay, just making sure.
All right. So going into this past week, leading up to it, like the week prior, I got a little bit sick. I managed to sort of circumvent, being completely out of the gym, or just being, laid up completely. But I could tell, it got stuffier, had a little bit of a sore throat. I could tell something was coming on. My wife was out of town, which means just a little bit, more responsibilities around the house, which meant a little bit later bedtime, a little bit earlier wake up. So on top of being a little bit sick, got a little bit, less sleep that week. Started to notice some very, very minor orthopedic stuff, where it was like, oh, the back of the knee feels a little funky. I felt this before, and it tends to happen, maybe if I'm just really pushing like the leg curl, effort or volume. Um, Maybe the inside of the knee a little bit. Like I felt this before with like lunge and split squat variations. And the sort of like AC joint area that seems to maybe act up if I'm doing a little bit much on the lateral raise side of things, and potentially anything that's like overhead. So in this particular case, it's like, I just mentally jot down like, all right, there's, some immune burden, that I took on here. There's a little bit of sleep debt that I took on here. And there's some, you know, early orthopedic signs that aren't, pain yet, but, are good, um, you know, good things for me to identify before they become anything more. And they seem historically to be associated with, you know, the volume or just total stress of specific types of exercises. And then on top of that, I have, you know, at that point, 16 weeks to go in contest prep. So now we see, okay, that's like an entire other block of training. It's not like, you know, there's 2 weeks to go before the show. So it's fallen right into kind of my expectation of like, all right, I've been training now. In this case, it was, you know, 8 weeks of training that I had been doing on this specific program. But prior to that, you know, I hadn't really taken any um, like major steps back in training. So it was like I did at one point have like an entire week off of training this year. And that basically like preceded the end of my off season. So it was like I didn't want to go away right before contest prep and take a week off because I knew it would take a couple weeks to like recover that progress and kind of get back to baseline. So I said, all right, let me go away, come back, have another like 8 weeks, you know, of off season to sort of get past my previous peak. And then following that 8 weeks, you know, I had another, you know, 8 weeks or so, you know, of contest prep. And there we are at that kind of like 16 week or so mark where it's like, okay, I've been doing the same program for a while. I'm picking up, you know, both on these symptoms, but also on just like the practical realities of what's, you know, happened over the last week, and also, you know, the time frame of what I have coming up, and just the overall stress that that's, you know, going to impart. Um, so then it was like, all right, one, you know, from like this like sleep diet immune standpoint, if I can just be in the gym a little bit less time because I'm training like late afternoon, early evening, I can get home earlier, go to bed earlier, and also just, you know, start to work on arranging my schedule in a way where I can push my bedtime back a little bit. I implemented actually melatonin upon arriving home. So, like 2, 3 hours before bed, take a little bit of melatonin. Then in the morning, do actually a little bit of like a light box to just try to actually shift my circadian rhythm back a little bit and get to bed a little bit earlier. And I was very successful this past week. I actually got an hour and a half of additional sleep on average per day. Um,
It's a lot.
so yeah, and that's something that I want to carry over into the rest of prep. Like that becomes a major, major limitation. Like at the very end of prep, sleep, you know, is hard to come by, even if you do have the time. So just kind of banking some sleep ahead of time, which actually is a thing. And there's some research like on athletes going into stressful periods, actually accumulating a lot of extra sleep going into that time seems to be beneficial. So right now, that's a high priority, just knowing that previously, you know, that's been a limiter. So I thought I did a good job this week of, you know, setting up my schedule and, you know, setting up, you know, sort of other parameters, like I mentioned, with the supplementation and the light that could potentially just start to um, move that sleep cycle back a little bit. Um, so then from there, it was like, all right, we're going to be in the gym last time. We see that there's some of this orthopedic stuff, you know, starting to just give me like a little bit of an inkling of things, you know, are going, you know, in the direction of accumulating too much fatigue. So if I want to drop volume, I'm going to just choose first to drop volume from those exercises that I see as potentially, you know, being a little bit in excess right now. So that drops a certain amount of volume. And then on top of that, um, just looking at, you know, really at the last couple of years, and, you know, where my training volume has been at and how much progress I've been able to make over that time period. Again, it's very difficult, you know, to measure muscle growth, but when you're looking back on the time scale of a couple of years and you say, okay, this is the training volume, you know, I've been at, and I can clearly see like, you know, last time I was at this skin folds, like I'm at 45 millimeters last time I checked across 9 sites, probably a little lower now. Um, I was like 255 to 260. and this time I'm like 290, at the same skin folds. Or you could also say last time I was 290, what were my skin folds, which were, more like over, 80 to 90, whereas now they're like 45. And then you look at the pictures and it's like, okay, it's just so obvious that things have grown. Circumference measurements are bigger, and even bigger relative, to waist circumference. So across that time period, just so obvious progress has been made. And we're like, okay, clearly like training volume, is not the limiter at this point. That doesn't mean it's optimal. Theoretically it could be better, but it has been sufficient to make a substantial amount of progress. So I'm not going to make the bet that more, would be better at this point. And, as recovery reserves in terms of just like, calories drop, throughout this contest prep period, looking at just kind of how my training volume has waved during this time period, like how low have I gone, how high have I gone, looking at other bodybuilders and seeing like, what kind of training volumes are they using? What does their actual effort look like? If you're just watching like a YouTube video, and, what exercises are they choosing? You can start to, again, form a hypothesis and say, like, maybe I could actually do a little bit less. Like if I have made, all this progress, and the goal is really like fatigue management more than anything in this contest prep period. And as you get towards the end, it's like the expectation is not necessarily growing muscle, it's mostly maintaining. Um, I think that it would be fair to actually get a little bit of a reduction in training volume, as we approach like the, latter half of contest prep. So in that regard, let's say I dropped overall training stress this week, we'll call it, which is kind of like, you know, a little bit of an amorphous concept, but it's like, I dropped training volume by dropping some exercises. I dropped training volume by going from 3 to 2 sets on some things. And I also dropped, training stress by, I still went to failure on everything, but I didn't use assistance from a training partner. Like a lot of my exercises involve, you know, some way of a training partner or some implement, some special technique that allows me to sort of optimize the resistance profile and really go much further, into fatigue than most people are, for a given muscle group. So I've just found creative ways to do that. And this week I said, you know what, like the funny thing is when I train to, normal failure now, which is still probably a little bit past, what I observe most people doing when they call it failure, it feels super easy, like it's unsatisfying, and it's because it's all just relative, right? Like you think, oh, that sounds like a lot of sets, or oh, I couldn't survive that, or that sounds like, way more effort than I could survive. Like whatever the thing is, once you've been doing it for a long time, it becomes your norm. And that's one of the things that research isn't typically going to pick up on is just prior experience. So when it comes to the perception of fatigue, when your normal has been, I do sets to a, degree of effort and a degree of, local muscular fatigue that involves me modifying, machines or having someone else, assist me to really just grind out super, super slow reps or even overloaded eccentrics and stuff like that. When that's your norm and you take a step back to, okay, now I'm just going to go to failure, it feels ridiculously easy.
Mhm.
So for me, like there was no reason that I had to like not train to failure. It was already a big step down, to reduce those other things.
Yeah.
So
So I think an appropriate takeaway from that is not necessarily the specific mechanisms that you chose to alter, but more so just the general pattern of identifying first what specific issues you're maybe dealing with in greater proportion, addressing the specific things that need to be addressed relative to that, and then choosing within that framework that you've already laid out for that particular exercise or body part or joint, things to basically just do less of. And doing less is always relative to where you currently are and are coming from, as opposed to just the arbitrary, let's do 50% less volume, which could be completely fine, as a strategy. I think that's the principle based takeaway from that is that it doesn't even necessarily need to be in the ways that you might typically expect. It could be just finding any which way to do less, even if it seems like, effort is almost, the same. Like you're still going to failure, but, a quote unquote lesser degree of it, in a sense. I also think, go ahead.
The last time I think we discussed my deload was, and it wasn't, this is, in like enhanced bodybuilding, and this happens in natural bodybuilding too, no matter what, like the physiological concepts are the same. Is you're going to have some maintenance periods, more or less. And enhance, like, again, when you're looking at limiters, like health might be a limiter in the standpoint of like you just can't take maximal drugs forever. So there's time periods, that are typically called quote unquote blasting throughs, where it's like, all right, you maybe have a period, of higher drug use, and then you have a period that's equally as long or half as long, where you bring things down. The goal is more or less maintenance. And it's exactly the same paradigm as here. It's like, what's the rate limiter? What do we need to recover health wise? That's what you do during that time period. So last time I did an 8, 9 week, you know, period of sort of maintenance, so to speak. Um, I would just did drop sets for everything. It was like, previously I was doing, 3 sets to failure with just, whatever, basically just whatever rest, time was equal to the time my training partner was doing the sets, usually, 1 to 2 minutes between sets. And, I just wanted to be in the gym last time because I was training at a lower training frequency, which meant, long training days. So I wanted to, lift less overall weight throughout the session to, potentially just reduce orthopedic stress. And I wanted to be in the gym less time. So I just did the exact same thing, but instead of 3 sets with 1 to 2 minutes rest, I just did a set, drop set, another drop set. So it was 3 sets. And, overall, like the total volume load or, reps times, sets times weight would have been less. Very likely the training stimulus would have been a little bit less than if, I was, completely resting, but not so much less that it's just, no longer meaningful. And I cut the time that I was in the gym, by half or so by doing those drop sets. I cut the stimulus a little bit, but I also wasn't in a position from a rate limiting standpoint to really make progress, much like I'm describing at the end of contest prep. If you're going to lower your food, lower your drugs, what have you, like if you're not in a position environmentally to make progress, your training should align with that. So reduce the training stress a little bit, got in and out of the gym a lot faster, trained with much lower average loads, but also that first set was still the same load, so that when I came back to the next phase, I was still very comfortable, training with those loads. I didn't have to kind of work back up to it again. So it's just another example of like, I don't, I don't think I've ever heard someone be like, oh, I'm going to do drop sets, for my rest, time, right? Like my deload is going to be to do drop sets. Cause it just, when you hear that, you're like, drop sets is an intensity technique, it means we're going harder. And it's just like, no, that's just how you respond emotionally, like to the idea of doing drop sets. It's just gonna like hurt a lot, and you're gonna, scream and flail. But like that really doesn't have to be the case. Like if you're gonna do the same amount of sets, it's gonna be a reduction in training stress. So as long as you don't have a strong emotional association with that, you're introducing, potentially different stimulus. You're going to get better. That's a nice thing too, is when you do like a bridge period or deload period, more of like a bridge maintenance period where it is a little bit longer. When you do a different stimulus, the cool thing is you keep improving. So
Mhm.
one thing that sucks about doing a maintenance period is you have to watch yourself maintain. But if you just change the training stimulus again, ask yourself, like, what would be fun? What do I want to do? What do I want to limit? And all of a sudden, now your maintenance period is something you actually want to show up for, whatever that means to you. And you actually get to see yourself make progress. Like, even though you might not be putting on muscle, you get to see your performance sort of artificially go up because you've just changed the constraint. So it looks like you're performing, better. And that's a much more enjoyable thing to show up for And that's a reason in and of itself, to just pick something novel.
Yeah, this is a concept that back in my powerlifting days I explored because there was the whole proactive reactive deload thing, but then there was this other separate category of deloads that this guy Mike Tushir, who you may have heard of, sort of, I don't know if he coined it or if he just popularized it, but he instead called it like a pivot, and he would usually do like a 1 to 3 week phase of just completely different exercises as primary. So, instead of maybe flat barbell bench, it was incline barbell or, standing overhead or something like that. That was sort of vaguely a similar, but kind of not similar pattern. And you could just go all out fucking RPE 10, RIR 0 on them. And you would still just be, so much more recovered and less fatigued by the time you went back to the mains because, as we were talking about earlier, that progression scale is just exponentially different, in the initial weeks and the initial phases of even just a slight variance. Like it could even just be like the exact same joint angles with a different implement, right? If you change one aspect of any, force direction in the exercise, even if it's just barbell to Smith machine or barbell to dumbbell, like the results and the outcomes can be drastically different. And I think um, something that we have probably talked about before on the podcast, but also just I get confused about what we talk about on recording versus off because it's all mushing together. But just in case we haven't mentioned it, I find the idea of just changing intention super interesting. And so for example, you might not even change anything about the specific amount of sets that you're doing in a week, but instead you may just approach those sets in a way where it's like, okay, I'm really just gonna, maybe I just really focus on uh control a little bit more. I noticed that maybe I get a little bit sort of too momentum-y in this exercise. Maybe I'm starting to push, beyond the technique that I wanted to. Let me just really put a super profound degree of attention to technique and slowing things down. And that in and of itself, obviously, most of the time just decreases load, but the perception of effort is still incredibly high. So I think, much like you said, there are many ways to sort of skin the cat, and however you choose to do that, I think it all sort of just leads back to that fundamental principle of what do you find to be not necessarily relaxing, but what do you find to be more enjoyable while still maintaining the sort of qualities that you're looking to maintain within a given week or set of weeks. So I think how you come off of a deload and how you sort of reintroduce yourself into training is maybe a good topic for another podcast. But we did actually, we ended up having some questions in the community that are sort of bigger questions than we probably want or have the time to answer right now. But just very briefly, because I think it will be easy to touch on, someone was essentially asking about like, long bulking and cutting phases versus like these aggressive mini cuts and mini bulks that people are doing. And I think that almost relates directly to, just our conversation earlier of like, well, what timeline, are you sort of laying out? Because I don't necessarily think that, something like an aggressive mini cut, 2 weeks, or I mean, mini bulking, I don't know, I don't know how much sense that would make, right? But an aggressive mini cut, it would be like you're eating substantially less, but you're doing it for a much shorter time frame. And so it's interesting how all these different kinds of questions appear superficially to be very, very different in terms of the content of the question, but you could ultimately sort of relay both kinds of questions back to that same principle of like, well, what is the timeline and how long am I giving myself to accomplish this thing? And as a consequence of that, am I going to do, more in a shorter period or just less on average overall through a longer period? So I don't know if anything for you comes up, but that's kind of where I wanted to wrap up, today, unless you have anything else to sort of add.
I forgot about that conversation we had about intention, which wasn't on the podcast, but or one of the things I forgot that I almost always do on like a deload or this, transition into another block is that I will, I'm already, like I've mentioned in previous podcasts, not necessarily looking back on my previous week's performance and, trying to beat that number. But just even the idea that I'm trying to progress is very different than the idea that I'm trying to maintain. So just the mindset of coming into a week where you're just thinking like, okay, the goal of this week is recovery and it doesn't matter, how well I perform, really, really changes things. Um, I think a lot of people will have the experience of coming into a deload and just feeling really weak, not just because of the fatigue they've accumulated, but because of, the intention that they come into that session with. So one of the things I'll do, for example, is just not even count reps at all. So, when I'm trying to track performance, even if I don't know what the previous week's reps were, I still need to count the reps to know, if my progress, is trending upwards over time. But on a deload week, I will likely just not count reps at all and just focus on how perfectly can I do these reps. And I think that does actually like have a pretty significant impact on performance. And that's one more layer where you can come into it where, you're just another level tuned down, right? Like we've discussed many times this, idea of just like the level of, excitation or like the level of arousal, that you come into the set with. And there's multiple levels to how much you can tune that. And, it's not just like somewhere in the middle between sleeping and, lifting a car off your child. Like you're going to be, on a normal training week where you're trying to make progress, you're still going to lean more towards, slightly higher effort, slightly higher arousal, but not so high that it doesn't further, increase performance to a meaningful degree, but does, impact fatigue. In this case, you just dial it down a little bit more and you just kind of come in with like, I'm just going to do this rep so perfect and I'm going to feel it and I'm going to squeeze it, and you don't worry at all about how many reps you're going to do. And that's a really great reset now coming into the next block that is going to serve as your baseline. And it's another way where, again, you can see performance across a block in a little bit more like measurable quantity. If you start that block and you just kind of reset your intention of just like, how perfect, can I do this again? Obviously, your intention, the whole block is, to execute that with, consistently in terms of not just changing your execution or your tempo, but just a reset, coming into another block, a deload, a maintenance period is a really good way to just now like set the bar again and sort of climb back up from that point. And then, thoughts on like the mini cuts. I agree that like the mini bulk, doesn't really make sense. It's just too short of a timeline, to really accrue any muscle mass. But fat loss is going to happen on a shorter time frame. So I think it's like, it's totally realistic, especially if you're just starting at a higher body fat. Basically, the higher body fat you're starting from, the more aggressive you can be. So you certainly could, do something relatively short and aggressive if you're not at a point where you have a lot of fatigue. And part of that concept of fatigue might just be, if you're super, super lean, there are things that got you there that are going to impart fatigue. But if you're not, and you're just, a little fatter than you want, then something quick and more aggressive, could be good. But I think the issue with that is like, if you find that that is like the spot that you arrive at more often than not, there's probably something on a greater level that's just not really set up well with your programming. So if you find that you just need to make rapid adjustments all the time, like there's probably a greater issue with how you're setting things up. So I would just argue that like that just doesn't typically come up, in my paradigm or the paradigm of people that I work with, just simply because of, better long-term planning.
Yeah, and I love this conversation overall and just the kind of general notion that this is a meant to be a gray area conversation, right? And the more black and white I think that we think, the more that we unnecessarily restrict ourselves to ideas and concepts that are, we'll say, potentially at a specific level less, optimal for the given, situation and context. Because, when you get introduced to these concepts for the first times, or for the first time, it's super common just to take whatever you hear as truth and as fact. So if someone says, you need to take a deload every X amount of weeks and you need to do it this way, that person may not realize that who they're talking to is someone who's never heard about these concepts before, and they're just like learning about it for the first time, like you learn about torque and you understand like what the component parts of that are. And so I think that for anyone listening who's maybe newer to this kind of framework, I think the big takeaway is that, it's not necessarily that there are no right answers, because I don't believe that to be true either. But I do think that the right answer has the potential to vary widely depending on who is listening. And so I think that the more that we can give people tools to kind of experiment with, rather than just straight answers to subscribe to, the more that people can think for themselves and navigate for themselves. And that ultimately, I think, it leaves everyone much better off, both the people who are communicating the information and the people who are sort of taking it in. So that's a good place to, I think, wrap things up. And next week, for those of you who are listening still an hour and a half in, if you're in the community, we will be giving the Zoom link to community members to attend the podcast live, so that you can actually ask questions during the live recording if there are any points of confusion or additional things that you want us to answer. So I'll put the link to the community in the description, and hopefully I will see some of you there.